Hello, welcome to Frequencies. Tuning into frequencies of human behavior, perspective, and empathy. I'm Matt, and today we're going to do something a little different, something pretty cool, I think. We're going to kick off a series, and today is going to be the beginning of that series where we're going to explore the generations, right? All the generations ranging from the silent generation to Gen Z. So it'll be pretty fun, right? Lots to talk about, how those generations shaped us, what we experience and how they've influenced the world we live in today. Like I said, we'll be starting with the silent generation. Then we'll move into the boomers, followed by Gen X, the millennials, and Gen Z. It should be a really interesting run of conversations. I'm excited to kick it off. With today, we're going to start with the silent generation. Yes, the silent generation. And they're an important one. Even if by the sound of their name, it might seem like they stayed out of the spotlight. No offense intended there. But it's a generation that in many ways didn't speak much about what they went through. It's kind of how they got their name. And they went through a lot. This is a group of people who lived through an incredibly turbulent time, massive societal shifts, war, economic pressure, cultural expectations that were rigid, firm, and in many cases unforgiving. And yet they didn't really talk about it. They didn't really fight. Minimal protest, just not much of a stand there. I'm a millennial. My grandparents were part of the silent generation. And from what I've experienced and from what I hear from a lot of people, there's a common thread. They kept things in. Now, I never met either of my grandfathers. And in my case, alcoholism played a huge role in that. But the more conversations I have, the more I realize that wasn't uncommon for that generation at all. I know so many friends. I have so many friends, once we start talking ancestry and whatnot, it's very common. It just shows up again and again. And that starts to point to something deeper, in my opinion, because what's most interesting about the silent generation isn't just what they lived through. It's what came out of it. They raised the boomers. Yes, the boomers. The baby boomer generation, born between 1945 and 1964, I believe. Yes, the baby boomers. And whether you love them, hate them, or somewhere in between, the boomers have had a massive impact on society. They've shaped systems, economies, and expectations in ways we're still dealing with today. I'm pretty sure they hold the majority of the wealth in America. So to say that they've been an influence is an understatement. So naturally, there's going to be some overlap in these conversations. I'll probably reference the boomers here and there for sure, but we'll save that deep dive for the next episode, obviously. Today is about the silent generation, though. Their experiences, their silence, and the lasting effects of both of those. So let's get into it. Let's tune in. So The world we're living in right now, this system, this culture, all of it didn't just appear out of nowhere, right? It was built, it was formed, it was kind of created over time. And I'll be honest, I talk about this kind of stuff a lot on this show, big layered topics, the kind where one idea connects to 10 others, and suddenly you're down 5 other different fucking rabbit holes trying to explain one thing. My ADHD brain loves that, but my brain also absolutely hates it. I apologize. I get so sidetracked so easily because I feel like all of those subcategories are super relevant. So I think it's critical, but I need to stay on topic because there's a ton to talk about. But in this series, I'm going to do my best to stay focused, to zoom in, because this is the first episode in a series about all of the generations, going back to the silent generation, and how each one helped shape the world we're in today. And yes, some ways they made an absolute mess of it. Maybe a little sarcasm there, but not entirely. Today we're talking about the silent generation, and they're incredibly important, not just because of what they lived through, but because of what they passed down. The systems they accepted, the norms they reinforced, and ultimately how they raised the boomers. I told you it's gonna come back to them often, and I feel like they're a critical part of this. But that's where things really start to scale, is when the boomers come in. And to be fair, it didn't necessarily start with the silent generation either. The generation before them, the greatest generation, they played a role too. That's the generation from 1900 to 1924, 1925, I think. And while I'm not doing a full episode on them, they matter in this context because each generation inherits something and then amplifies it, What gets passed down doesn't just continue, it multiplies. And if you go back to episode 2, The Mental Strains of a Changing World, I touched on one of the biggest shifts in modern history, the rise of the automobile. Not just the invention of it, but what it did to society. Because once the automobile became mainstream, everything had to change around it. I think the automobile changed society a great deal, but another invention, another thing that kind of got introduced to us that I think is even bigger, which we'll get there eventually, is the cell phone and the internet. I think that invention and introduction into society, it's had even more of an influence on us than the automobile. And that shift that happens in the Gen X, Millennial, Gen Z era, obviously is the main shift. That's the shift in the timeline. But we'll get there eventually. But with the automobile, with all of the industries that were involved with it as well, oil, rubber, manufacturing, infrastructure, banking, the world changed, the economy changed, but especially banking, because suddenly people needed access to something they couldn't afford outright. So loans became normalized. Debt became part of everyday life. And with that came a massive shift in the cost of living. That's an adjustment. People have to adjust to that. It's not something you just, can just say, okay, I sign up for that, Think about the people living through that at the time. There were plenty who were content with a simpler life, working their land on the farm, living within their means, not chasing this new industrial pace. And then almost overnight, the world starts telling you that's not enough anymore. You got to come play our game and pay into it, and because this is just how it's going to work. We need your land. You're going to drive a car. That's a huge adjustment for an entire generation. Adapt or fall behind. And for those who didn't adapt or didn't want to, what happened to them? That's where things get a little bit uncomfortable and questionable, because it's not talked about in history books. It's not talked about in classrooms. And because during that same time period, you also see the rise of these giant, large-scale mental institutions that were full to capacity and beyond, mind you. Sound a little out there, but it's part of the equation. You can't deny it. Not to mention the orphan trains, but we won't go there. I'm not here to make wild claims, but it's fair to ask questions about how society defines normal during times of a massive change? Who gets labeled as unstable? How do they determine that? The person who resists the system or the system itself? That's a conversation worth having. But here's what we do know. The silent generation lived right in the middle of all of this. The pressure to conform, the rapid industrial expansion, the restructuring of daily life, they lived through that. They had to learn how to change making a giant adjustment in their life. And for the most part, they didn't push back. There's not a ton of large-scale riots or protests in the streets. That's just, they didn't make noise. They adapted. They kept their heads down. They followed the path in front of them. Because the alternative, it didn't look great. So they complied. They built, and they participated in shaping this system, whether they fully agreed with it or not. And that silence, that willingness to fall in line, it didn't just stay with them. It became the foundation for the next generation. And that's where things start to get pretty interesting. This is really where the silent generation gets its name, right? It comes from their willingness to comply. There wasn't a lot of striking. There wasn't a lot of protesting. And these massive societal changes were happening fast and at scale. They largely went along with it. Minimal resistance. Keep your head down. Do what needs to be done. And part of that compliance ties directly into something huge that was being introduced into everyday life at that time. Debt. And think about it. For the first time on a large scale, people were being expected really, to take on debt at a young age. Think about what that actually means. You're asking an entire population to spend money they don't have on things they're being told they now need. Cars, primarily. And not just as a luxury, but as a gateway to this new version of life. Mobility, opportunity, freedom. And to be clear, the automobile is incredible. We all know this. What it allowed people to do and how it reshaped distance and access, it's hard to overstate the impact. But the question is, at what cost? Because alongside that innovation came a system that required buy-in, literally. The silent generation was the first to really step into that system, to normalize it, taking out loans, carrying debt, figuring out how to pay it back after the fact. It's a concept that hadn't existed before this time. The moment you sign that paper that says, I don't have this money now, but I will, you've changed your relationship with work, with time, with pressure. Now, you're leveraged by your bank, by your employer, by the system itself. And it didn't just stop at the cars, because once people could travel farther, everything expanded. Housing developments exploded. Now, it's not just a car, it's a home too. More loans, more debt, more obligation, and it was all being framed as normal, responsible even. Just get a job, pay it off. This is what you're supposed to do. Think about all of the homes that were built in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Tons of homes. So many neighborhoods here in the St. Louis area built 40s and 50s and 60s. That's the silent generation getting a little older, having their boomer kids in those houses. That's where the big city areas started expanding into these suburbs and residential areas. That is a giant adjustment and a new lifestyle that was being introduced to an entire generation with their kids. Come and start your big family, your American dream, And while it wasn't really quite as deeply embedded as it is today, this is where it really took root. Then comes the next phase. Their children. Like I said, the boomers. Born into this world, raised inside these rules, taught from the beginning that this is just how life works. You got to get a house, you got to get a car, you take on the debt, you build the life. And visually, It looked perfect, didn't it? The neighborhoods, the green lawns, car in the driveway, picture of the American dream. We've all seen the version of it. Like I said, and it was the 40s, 50s, and 60s. If you look at just the posters, the movies, the commercials, it's clean, it's polished. I mean, almost too perfect. It is. Like the Truman Show type of vibe. That's where they kind of modeled that. I feel like that Truman Show is a perfect encapsulation of that, among other famous movies. But it was all being marketed. That was the marketing. There were no smartphones capturing the messy parts, was there? No constant stream of reality. No reality TV, that's for sure. What people saw was curated actors, advertisements, carefully framed images of what life was supposed to look like. But underneath that image, there were rules, a lot of rules. And this is where the silent part really goes deeper than just economics or work. It hits the home. You didn't talk about problems. You didn't talk about anything that broke the image. Illegitimate children, no, you don't talk about that. Shh. Sex before marriage, oh no, shh. You don't talk about that. Struggles inside the home, absolutely not. Alcoholism, abuse. There was abuse. We don't talk about that. You just don't say it out loud. It didn't happen, and we're a perfect family. Hi. If it didn't fit the mold, it didn't exist. Or at least you pretended it didn't. And that kind of pressure to maintain an image at all cost, that does something to people. Because now you're not just managing debt. You're managing perception. You're living a life where being exposed, being seen as outside the norm, can cost you everything socially. So people stay quiet. Even when things weren't okay. Even when things were falling apart behind closed doors. And that silence, that suppression, that need to appear perfect no matter what, that becomes part of the environment the next generation grows up in. And you can probably already guess, that doesn't just disappear. That creates a pretty unique and potentially toxic environment to grow humans in, if I'm not mistaken. But to really bring this down to earth, to make this more than just a theory, I want to share something personal, something from my story, because I've seen this play out in my own family. Over the years, I've spent a lot of time digging into my family history on Ancestry. It actually became a pretty healthy outlet for me, especially when I got sober. It gave my brain somewhere to go, something to focus on. And I ended up learning a lot more than I expected, especially about one of my grandfathers who I never met. I never met either of my grandfathers, actually, but this one in particular, I was able to trace parts of his story. And what I found was super complicated. I'll try my best to explain, but from what I could piece together, he had multiple relationships, multiple children, and he wasn't really present for any of them, including us, including me, my family. And the story I grew up with versus what I uncovered, totally different. So, I'm digging through the records. I'm scrolling. My Ancestry account goes back to 2006. I've always been interested in this stuff, building my tree. And back then, even I was just guessing. But then at some point, soon after I got sober, I decided to submit my DNA, and that's when things got interesting. Getting real data. When you send in your DNA, you'll get a list back of other people who've sent in their DNA, and you can find matches, right? Well, I got a match. I got 100,000 of matches, but one match was pretty interesting to me. It was someone I've never heard of before. I'll call him Delbert. But this wasn't some distant connection. This was closer than some family members that I know. Close enough that I'm sitting here thinking, who the fuck is this guy? So I start digging, and eventually I traced the connection back to my grandfather. Now, Delbert had done some work on his own family tree, and he left that tree public on there, so I was able to see it. And that helped a ton. I could see the names, the relationships, pieces of the puzzle. Now, it also became pretty confusing because they weren't accurate, and this is how he saw it, but it was definitely pieces of the puzzle. And after a ton of backtracking and, checking up on census data and timelines and connections, and I started to see the picture come together. Well, turns out Delbert was likely the son of a woman I'll call Tilly. But on paper, that's not how it looked. On paper, Delbert was raised as the son of another man, who's Delbert Sr. So he even took this man's name, Delbert Jr. It was their last name. I won't say the last name, but he took this man's name. And Tilly, she was actually his aunt. So looking at his tree, he had Delbert Sr. listed as his dad, who had been remarried several times. So it wasn't really clear who he thought was his mother, because you can look at all of the wives and it can get kind of gray in those areas. But he had Aunt Tilly over on this separate wing on the side of his tree, which was unique. I rarely have ever seen this. So he had Tilly on there, but she was off to the side. You can label sisters of a father. You can go super into detail, but he had Tilly off to the side. He knew something was up. I'm confident in this. But when you line up the timelines, when you look at the details, like the story of what his tree was showing was totally different. And the most likely scenario is that Tilly had children out of wedlock, and instead of that being known, because that wasn't acceptable at that time, the family created a solution. Tilly and Delbert Sr.'s parents probably had a lot to do with this. They decided that Tilly would hand over Delbert to her brother, Delbert Sr., and Delbert would raise him as his own. And those children would be raised as someone else, giving them a different name, shift the roles, protect the image, keep it quiet, don't tell anybody. Tilly didn't have any kids yet. She's a pure woman. Keep it, shh, Delbert, that's yours. You raise them. But until Tilly would still be there, she'd still be involved, just not as mom, but as Aunt Tilly. I'll think about that for a second. Not just the decision itself, but what it takes to maintain that every day, for years, for a lifetime. That's not just a family dynamic, that's a performance of a lifetime. And it shows you how far people were willing to go to protect this idea of the perfect life, quote unquote, because that image mattered more than the truth. Now, I did try to reach out to some of the people connected to that side of the family, and I was successful. And I was careful about it, and I didn't just come in hot, and I didn't try to disrupt anything. I was approaching them with questions to see if there was interest, to see if there was questions about, Delbert's mother and father. So I was careful, and I just wanted to share what I found. And eventually, eventually a lot of them did allow me to kind of share my findings with them, but most of them were not interested, or they didn't believe me, or they kind of believed me and they just didn't care. And I thought that was super fascinating, a little weird, to be perfectly honest with you. Because even now, decades later, it seems like that instinct is still there. Don't talk about it. We'll just keep it. The story's fine. It's sad. But I did learn that Tilly was around. Like she wasn't just the aunt at another house. I got a hold of one of the grandnieces or something, told me, oh, Aunt Tilly, yeah, she raised them like she raised all them boys. Because there was Delbert and another brother that looked alike, and then there was two other brothers that were of the foursome that didn't really look like these two, but Aunt Tilly raised them all as her own. So she was always around, you know. What a unique dynamic, what a unique lie to live. Not to take any judgment out, it's a different time. So it's wild. It really is. And that right there, that split between reality and presentation, that's the silent generation. You know, now here's where it connects forward, right? Delbert, his brother, my mom, my aunt, and there were a few other ones too, some other bogeys out there that either I don't know or potential matches that I haven't confirmed yet, but all of them were all boomers, all born around the same time. That was another piece of evidence. They were all born a year apart, some of them maybe even the same year, but different states, different, very interesting stuff. I couldn't stop once I started, but they were all boomers and they all grew up inside of that environment, that type of environment alone, where certain things are understood but never said, where appearances matter more than truth, where you follow the rules, you protect the image, and you don't ask too many questions, right? And when you grow up in that, that becomes your normal. And in my opinion, that kind of environment is dangerous and super toxic. Not because anyone involved is evil, not at all. Like I said, my grandfather, I don't know what he went through. He was a veteran. He fought in World War I or World War II in the Air Force. And that alone could explain a lot. You know, the trauma and things he potentially had to do, I don't know. I'm not here to judge him. I didn't know him. I didn't know anything about him. But those actions have ripple effects till the end of time, essentially, when you're creating these wings of these new branches of family trees that are spewed and started and sown from nothing, essentially, because one of them jumps out and had no intentions of sticking around, or, you know, it's, again, a different time. But what came out of that? Entire branches of families. People who grew up disconnected, confused, or carrying things they didn't even have context for. A lot of alcoholism too, a lot of early deaths, a lot of unresolved trauma. And when you zoom out, it starts to paint an even bigger picture. Because this isn't just one family story. This is a pattern, a system that prioritized appearance over honesty, stability over truth, silence over understanding. When that becomes the foundation, what you build on top of it is going to carry those cracks every time. Now, eventually, I'm probably going to do an episode about my beliefs on abortion or reproduction rights. And I don't even, and even that phrase doesn't quite sit right with me, because I think the conversation is bigger than that, bigger than just abortion. To me, it's about reproduction rights, and that conversation should include both men and women. I don't like how this issue gets reduced to something that only women are supposed to carry. Men need to be held accountable too, for sure. If we only frame it as a women's issue, I know it is their body, and I respect that, but it takes two to tango. You know, and it becomes way too easy to turn into a political talking point at that point, instead of a real responsibility conversation. Honestly, I think it's just disgusting. And I know I'm going to have a lot more to say about that later. And I know there's going to be a lot of people who don't like what I have to say, because I have a pretty strong opinion on it. I hated politics growing up, and hearing about abortion, and I was always confused of why this was even part of it. And then I recognized this is the future of our species here. So yeah, it's pretty important, you know? But for now, I'll just say this. When we're talking about creating the next generation of human beings, it should not fall entirely on one person to figure it out alone. And that's exactly the kind of imbalance that creates damage downstream. And that damage doesn't stay isolated. It spreads, It shapes childhoods. It shapes entire families. It shapes the people who grow up inside of those homes. And that's part of what we're talking about here. The silent generation lived through a world that produced a lot of those conditions, and the generations that followed inherited the consequences. A lot of boomers talk about how hard things were when they were growing up, you know? And in a lot of cases, they're not wrong. Many of them really did have extremely difficult childhoods. But what I can't stand is how that sometimes gets turned into a kind of gatekeeping, like suffering is proof of worth, or like younger generations automatically have it too easy because their struggles look different. That cycle keeps going. You know, the silent generation told their stories to the boomers, and the boomers told their stories to Gen X and millennials. And now people my age are kind of doing the same thing with Gen Z and Alpha. I catch myself doing it every once in a while, obviously. I mean, you got to teach them about the past, but I try not to pretend hardship is a competition. And I definitely don't want to turn my own experiences into some back in my day lecture, you know. I do it on occasion for fun as a teaching point, but that's not the point. The point is to understand how these patterns get passed down and what they do to people over time. And that's exactly what we're going to do now. And to better kind of visualize this situation that's happening, I came up with a metaphor, of course. And I'm probably going to come back to this metaphor periodically throughout this entire series because I think it captures the dynamic extremely well. It's the way different generations talk about how hard life was when they were young and then turn around and act like the next generation should have to suffer the same way. And that mindset drives me insane. It drives me crazy. You know, it's the idea of I went through misery, so you should too. Or, you know, I had it hard, so you don't get to complain. I don't buy it. I don't like it. I firmly disagree. So here's the metaphor. It involves snow days, you know, with school snow days, right? You know, we've all experienced this. We all know this situation. If you've got kids in school nowadays, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. Schools now will call school off pretty early. Sometimes the night before, sometimes the morning of, because it's super cold. And honestly, sometimes it feels like they cancel school even if there's a rumor of bad weather. And every once in a while, I catch myself thinking, you know, man, back in my day, you know, we'd go to school and blah, 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 you know. And I did it a couple times. I did. But then I caught myself. I stopped and thought about it because that's exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about. That's the cycle. I remember being a kid and hearing adults say things like, you know, we'd walk 5 miles to school in the snow with socks for gloves. We didn't have any buses, you know, like you guys like my old man voice. So that's it. I could give it a little something more, but that's my old man voice. But we used to hear those stories all the time. And those stories get passed down like some kind of badge of honor in a way when they were saying it to us. But then when the weather actually did get bad, those same adults were the ones saying, why didn't they just call it off? Now I got to leave work. Now I got to do this. I mean, why wouldn't they just call it off? This is ridiculous, you know? So which is it? You know, were things so tough that nobody should ever be expected to do it again? Or were things so tough that everyone else should be forced to live the same way? That's where the logic really falls apart. And honestly, when schools close early now, maybe they're not being soft. Maybe they're being smart. Maybe they're getting it right. You know, maybe they're looking ahead and trying to avoid a mess of buses stuck in the snow. Parents scrambling in the middle of school, you know, juggling work schedules, and everybody getting upset because the system waited too long to make the decision. Maybe they're getting it right. And that's the point. A lot of boomers, and some Gen X too, if we're being honest, carry this belief that because they suffered, younger generations need to suffer too. That's not wisdom. That's not toughness. That's just passing pain down like it's some kind of inheritance. And that belief shows up everywhere. It shows up in the way people talk about work, especially. It shows up in the way they talk about school. It shows up in the way they judge younger people for wanting something better. We had terrible working conditions. So what makes you think you deserve better? This one's the worst one. These kids nowadays don't want to work. Whew. That's a tough one. I don't like hearing that one at all. I didn't really, I was buying it for the longest time. I have worked a lot of hours, 60, 70, sometimes 80-hour shifts. How many 24-hour shifts have you worked? I worked, and I don't like it when I'm a millennial. So when people say these kids and millennials don't, I take offense to it because I worked my ass off. So when I hear that, that these kids don't want to work, it makes me furious. But that's the mentality. Like, just because something was bad then doesn't mean it has to stay bad now. Just because people were underpaid doesn't mean underpaying people is suddenly acceptable. Just because the system used cheap labor and called it normal doesn't mean we're supposed to keep pretending that's okay. That's a huge part of the problem. There's this blurry line between jobs for students, starter jobs, and actual living wage work. Not every job is supposed to be a career. Sure, I agree with that. There should be kids for our students. There should be jobs for our students. But if a job can't support a human being, then it should not be treated like a full-time life path. That mindset of what it was then versus what it is now, that's not entitlement. That's reality. Because a lot of those older systems were built on being exploited, underpaid, and told to be grateful for it. And just because they lived through that doesn't mean everybody else should have to. That's the part I want to keep coming back to, really, because this whole series is really about one thing: how the pain gets passed down and whether we're brave enough to stop doing that. Maybe this system is trying to change that. No, fuck that. Maybe we, the people, this younger generation, these younger generations, are trying to fix that. And maybe the younger generations, like the millennials, Gen X, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, were the ones saying, no, we don't want to work ridiculous hours in miserable conditions just to prove we can suffer. We want the ability to raise our kids, stay involved, and create better environments for them. Just working 60, 70 hours every week until we're 67 and then getting to retire and live this, that's when you get to really live life. For people to think that that's good and that's normal, that is strange. Because that's the way it was, right? That's why it's normal, because that's just the way it is. That's when we're supposed to be raising our kids. Maybe it looks like that in the old model, but the new model, that's not how it's supposed to be. Just in reality, that shouldn't be how it is. Maybe we don't all get married. Maybe some of us do, some of us don't. Maybe some relationships are interracial. Ooh, you can't do that. I love how that's being normalized, by the way. I love it. But maybe some children are planned. Maybe some aren't. Maybe two people decide they're not right for each other and choose not to force a family into a situation that isn't healthy. Those choices matter. Because when a child is brought into a home that doesn't want them or can't support them or isn't built to care for them, that creates a bad environment from the start. That affects everything downstream. I know that's a conversation a lot of people don't want to have, but I think it's an important one. This is the future of our species. The children are not raised by ideals. They're raised by people, by parents, by the adults who show up every day to do that work. And if the adults aren't there emotionally, physically, or willingly, that leaves a mark. And that's why I think this matters so much. Not every boomer is the same. 100% sure of that. Not every silent generation parent was cold, distant, and absent. That's not what I'm saying at all. No, my parents were boomers. They stayed in my life. My mom's a boomer. My real father passed away. He was an alcoholic and kind of wasn't a part of my life throughout a good amount of my younger and teenage and 20s and 30s. My real father was not there much, but my stepfather came in. My mom remarried, and my stepfather came in and raised me as his own, me and my brothers and sister. He had 2 kids as well, and he raised us as his own. I still call him dad to this day. He's an amazing man. Smartest, strongest, most loving man I've ever known. All boomers. And, they stayed in my life, and they're a giant part in all of their grandchildren's lives as well. They tried. They're not perfect, but they try. And I think that matters. I also think millennials and, to a degree, Gen X are pushing back against the old script. We're more willing to stay involved with our kids, more willing to build actual relationships with them, more willing to question the idea that suffering automatically makes you stronger, or that making life harder for the next generation somehow builds character. It doesn't always do that. It sometimes takes the train off the tracks and derails them and creates major problems at a young age for many people. And that's where I keep coming back to the same thought. You can acknowledge how hard someone had it without insisting their grandchildren need to live the same way. I understand the hardship. I do. I respect the stories. I'm not trying to erase any of that. I recognize the hard life you lived. We recognize the hard life you lived. We are grateful and thankful that you guys made it through. It's impressive what you guys have done. It's talking to the boomers and a lot of the silent generation as well. We recognize it. But I don't think the answer is to pass that pain forward and call it wisdom. If anything, the real lesson should be this. You survived something hard. Good. We should honor that. And we will. I think we should. We acknowledge it, we honor it, and say thank you. But maybe the next generation doesn't need to be punished for it. Maybe it's a good thing that the kids today don't have to walk 5 miles through the snow with socks for gloves just to get to school. Maybe it's a good thing that schools call it early when conditions are bad. That's all. Maybe it's a good thing that we're trying to do it differently. We're trying to get it right. And if that makes some people uncomfortable, so be it. I'd rather be part of the generation that breaks the cycle than the one that keeps defending it. This is the Silent Generation episode. I know I kind of went on a tangent there with the boomers, but I warned you the boomers are going to hear a lot of this. The boomers are a vital part of this. I think there is technically more millennials alive than boomers, but when all the boomers were alive, there were more boomers than millennials. Millennials are huge. The millennial generation, there's a lot of us. I didn't necessarily want this to go down a boomer tangent, but I had a feeling it would. And next episode is the boomers. And then we're going to talk about Gen X. Gen X, you sneaky snakes, you guys can blend in with the best of them. I can't wait. It's going to be a fun little episode. I like Gen Xers. They're interesting generation for sure. Millennials, obviously, can't wait to talk about that. And Gen Z. I appreciate you guys listening. Stick around for the rest of the series. It should be a fun bunch of conversations. If you like this episode, like it, share it, comment, do any of the button clicky stuff down below. I'd appreciate it. It helps the algorithm, helps the show. And stick around for the next episode and take it easy. Later.